Imagine how it must have been here in Shackelford County before the first white man came. The prairie spreading away like a promise across the land. A thick carpet of grass rolling and reaching to the far horizons. Space wide as the mind. Magnificent solitudes. An abundant sense of freedom. An austere kind of beauty all around, as if nature had parceled out her gifts with generous yet loving restraint on this rich but harsh landscape. Take away today's modern roads and houses, and our prairie land is basically much as it was at the time the first Anglo pioneers came this way. But the passage of time has brought change. Most of the tall blue-stem grasses are gone. Mesquite and prickly pear are more abundant. Only a few buffalo remain, curiosities now, of the thousands upon thousands that once grazed here. The Indians are gone. The keening cry of Comanche women in mourning is no longer carried on the wind. The first Anglo settlers' crude dugouts and Spartan houses are now mostly just ruins. In their old graveyards, the carved names of their dead have worn away until they now show but faintly on the native stone slabs that stand as sentinels of the past. Yet today, if you look along a bend of the clear fork of the Brazos River at daybreak, or walk across the ground where the old forts once stood, or stand silently inside the old houses and imagine the sounds that haunt the rooms where people once lived with their loved ones, you will sense there are ghosts and echoes rushing through time from their world to ours. For this seemingly remote and empty land for a brief time was a major crossroads on the old West Texas frontier, a stage upon which an epic human drama was played out. This frontier was the cutting edge of the wave of white immigration across the country. Here, their western expansion came to a halt as they encountered the wrath of the fierce, warlike Comanches, and the struggle for the land intensified between these two cultures. There took place on this northwest Texas frontier monumental changes and events that would shape history and mirror the image of the entire American West. And all this wild drama of lives and events that we now call the frontier experience took place only in the space of the allotted 70 years of a man's life. Some of the white settlers sensed that they were living in a transition time of great importance. They felt very keenly that their efforts and travails would lead to a better life for those who would come after them, and it did. But for those of the other culture, the Indians, it meant the end of their way of life. It really started in 1849 when the report of gold in California led to an accelerated rush of American citizens westward across the uncharted Great Plains. The Comanche Indians were incensed at this intrusion across their hunting grounds and often harassed the traveling white gold seekers' wagon trains. These bloody raids led to U.S. troops accompanying and trying to protect the immigrants on their trek across the plains. Such a detachment of U.S. soldiers led by Captain Randolph Marcy returned east from New Mexico across West Texas by a new route. Guided by 2 Indian scouts, Marcy passed close by our area along an ancient route that the Indians had traveled in antiquity across the Great Plains of West Texas. This trail went from vital waterhole to waterhole across the arid land and now became known as Marcy's Trail. One of the major southern overland routes to California, it passed through our area between present-day Albany and Throckmorton. Marcy's Trail slanted across the Comancheria, or land of the Comanches. This Indian tribe was of Shoshonean extraction and had inhabited the Wind River area of Wyoming until the late 1600s, when they were pushed south by more dominant, warlike Indian tribes. Intertribal warfare was a way of life among the Plains Indians. Somewhere in the Comanches' forced southward migration, they became one of the first Indian tribes to acquire and learn to use the horse that the Spaniards had brought to the ranchos of New Mexico. The Pueblo Indian Revolt of 1680 had caused the Spanish to hastily retreat south and abandon their New Mexico horse herds, which quickly scattered and reverted to the wild, where they became accessible to the Indian. The association of Comanche and horse was an epical happening. With the horse, the good hunter on foot became the superb buffalo hunter on horseback. With the horse, the Comanches developed a fierce, slashing mode of mounted warfare that devastated the Apaches and other Indian tribes who then claimed Texas. So Texas was not the ancestral land of the Comanches, as most people believe today. They had only been in Texas since the 1700s, when they invaded and bloodily forced out or killed the Apaches, Tonkawas, and other tribes. By the early 1800s, the Comanches, now a dominant equestrian warrior society, claimed most of Texas. Their fierce presence had stopped the migration of Hispanic settlers out of Mexico, but in the 1840s, the Comanches faced a more formidable, aggressive foe. Grimly they watched while this new invader of Texas, the white man, moved into their Comancheria from the east. Comanche warriors sang their wolf songs, painted their faces for war, and prepared to deal with these newcomers as they had previously done with the Hispanics, the Apaches, and other Indian tribes. The invading white men soon established a line of military forts diagonally across Texas to protect their settlers. Some of these pre-Civil War forts, such as Fort Belknap, Camp Cooper, and Fort Phantom Hill, were in our area. A network of military roads crisscrossed over what is now Shackelford County. In the shadow of these forts on the bottomlands along the streams and rivers, the first white pioneers established their ranches and farms. They dreamed of creating a new home in the wilderness, but what a hard price they paid for this dream. They suffered the cruelties of the violent weather of the Great Plains, with its sudden changes, droughts, and blazing summers, followed by bitter freezing winters with fierce blue northers, so different and with far less rainfall from the more predictable weather back east. Sometimes there was not enough to eat, and there was always the fear of sudden death or worse at the hands of Comanche warriors who lurked beyond their fields. As settlers went about their work, they subconsciously listened for the awful, quivering sound of a Comanche arrow's flight, or the heart-stopping scream of a Comanche war cry. Under such pressure, women grew old before their time. Besides the ever-present danger from Indians, men were involved in the physically dangerous violence that accompanied their cow work on the open range. There was little professional medical care available, and periodically disease struck at everyone, but especially the young. Many children died and were lowered beneath the prairie. The Comanches fought for the land with their usual ferocity. In the 1850s, Indian depredations raged along the West Texas frontier. In faraway Washington, D.C., Secretary of War Jefferson Davis tried to help the arrest settlers. In 1856, he sent the crack 2nd Cavalry Regiment under command of Albert Sidney Johnston to Texas and into our area. This single regiment included many officers who would soon become some of the greatest military leaders of the Civil War. 14 would achieve the rank of general, some for the North and some for the South. Generals to fight for the South were Robert E. Lee, John Bell Hood, Albert Sidney Johnston, Earl Van Dorn, Kirby Smith, and William Hardee. Future Union generals were George Thomas, later known as the Rock of Chickamauga, Kenner Girard, and George Stoneman. In 1856, 2nd Regiment soldiers were stationed near here at Camp Cooper, where then Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee was in command. Camp Cooper was located halfway between Fort Belknap and Fort Phantom Hill, to be near the newly established Comanche Indian Reservation on the Clear Fork of the Brazos. This reservation had a short, stormy, unsuccessful existence. Federal Indian agent Jesse Stem had previously established a trading post and farm nearby, where the first cultivated crops in this part of Texas were grown. Stem was ambushed and killed by renegade Kickapoos near Fort Belknap in 1854, but his farm continued to operate after his death for several years. Thomas Lambshead, a native of Devon, England, came to Texas as a Peters colonist. He is believed to have worked for Jesse Stem at his Clear Fork farm, and a stream near the site of Stem's farm is still known today as Lambshead Creek. The Matthews family's Lambshead Ranch, today the best known and most historical cattle ranch of the area, also took its name from this creek. While serving as the commanding officer at Camp Cooper, Robert E. Lee found the countryside harsh and arid in comparison with his home back in lush and verdant Virginia. In one of the many letters he sent home to his wife from Camp Cooper, he told about officiating in the cemetery at the burial service of a child, the small son of a sergeant. This is what Lee wrote.
He was as handsome a little boy as I ever saw. I was admiring his appearance the day before he was taken ill. His father came to me, tears flowing down his cheeks, and asked me to read the funeral service over the little body, which I did at the open grave. His little waxen farm was then committed to the earth. I hope I shall not be called on to do this again.
In 1858, John Butterfield's Overland Mail stagecoaches came rumbling into the Clear Fork station just downstream from Camp Cooper. No longer were people of this area isolated from the rest of the world, as the coaches of the Butterfield Overland Mail, while racing from St. Louis to San Francisco in 25 days, diagonally traversed across what later became Shackelford County. Smith Station, one of Butterfield's many stops for fresh teams, was located some 15 miles west of present-day Albany on a creek. Years later, this creek was named Chimney Creek for the abandoned station's rock chimney, which still may be seen today. The Butterfield stage line was remarkably efficient, but after only 3 years of operation, it suddenly left, never to return, for a strange stillness had come over all the activity along the frontier. More than 1,000 miles to the east at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, shots were fired that split the nation into a civil war. To participate in the war back east, all military troops were withdrawn from the frontier, as the military posts, including Camp Cooper, were abandoned. The busy traffic over the new roads connecting the Army posts ceased. With the Butterfield stage gone, the Army post abandoned, and the protecting soldiers removed, the settlers now found themselves alone, their isolated farms and ranches vulnerable to attack by fierce Comanche raiders. The settlers' worst fears were soon realized. One early morning in 1864, just northeast of our Clear Fork country, a horde of 750 Comanche warriors came thundering down the Elm Creek Valley. Families along Elm Creek were massacred, their homes burned, their women and children carried away, leaving surviving settlers along the frontier in a state of panic. With no protection from the Army anymore, some families fled, seeking safety back east. Others, of stouter stock, decided not to run, but to stay and fight for the land. Leaving their isolated farms and ranches, they banded together with their neighbors into several fortified communities. Fort Hubbard, Fort Clark, Fort Owlhead, Fort Davis, and Fort Mugginsville were in our area. Here they stayed, living and guarding their lives as best they could, holding on to their dreams of the future. It wasn't easy. Susan Newcomb writes in her diary from civilian Fort Davis on October the 24th, 1865.
We often hear of our friends or relatives being killed and scalped by the wild Indians. They are continually roving through our country, killing our comrades here and yonder. We have no troops stationed around to drive them away. They know that we are few in number, and they are trying to kill and drive us away from our country. But I hope the watchful eye of our great God is over us, and his strong arm our protector.
With such faith, the pioneers endured. When the American Civil War was over, U.S. soldiers returned to the Texas frontier. The sound of reveille was again heard across the prairie at day's first light. For in 1867, a new Army post called Fort Griffin was established on a hill near the Clear Fork of the Brazos River, some 10 miles downstream from Old Camp Cooper. This post would be very important in the Indian War campaigns of 1874 to 1876, when Colonel Randall McKenzie swept the Comanches out of West Texas and into Oklahoma reservations. The famous Black Buffalo soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry were stationed here, and most of the black citizens of Albany were descendants of these Fort Griffin soldiers. The ranchmen and their families left their civilian forts and moved near the new military base for protection. Once again, the roads and trails were filled with traffic. Traders and teamsters, merchants and craftsmen were drawn to the site. On the flat beneath the fort, a town sprang up called simply Griffin, or the Flat. It was Babylon on the prairie, and to its hastily constructed dance halls and saloons flocked gamblers, gunmen, and adventurous women. Red Nellie, Big Nose Kate Fisher, Hurricane Minnie, and Swayback Mag were some of the better-known soiled doves of the Flat, while a more glamorous and sophisticated female gambler named Lottie Dino reigned briefly as Queen of Fort Griffin. It was here in the Flat that Doc Holliday met Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson for the first time. Pat Garrett and John W. Poe, who later tracked down and killed Billy the Kid, were here, as was John Selman, who later would kill famous gunman John Wesley Hardin. Few towns in the Old West were as wild, woolly, and dangerous. Early settler Henry Herron described it thusly.
Fort Griffin, when I arrived there, was the toughest place I had ever seen, and it continued to be tough until after the soldiers left there in 1881. Lewd women infested the dance halls, among them Kate Gamble. She was part Indian and was called Indian Kate. Her house was a great rendezvous for cutthroats, murderers, and all other such characters.
West of Fort Griffin, great herds of buffalo grazed the rich short grass turf of the rolling plains all the way to the Caprock. There was profit to be made from buffalo hides, which now could be sold back east for nearly $4 each. People thought there were enough buffalo to last forever, and hunters outfitted at Conrad and Rath's large Fort Griffin store swarmed out west over the buffalo range. The slaughter began. Before long, over 100,000 buffalo hides a month were hauled into Griffin. It became the center of the Texas hide enterprise that would in just a few years completely destroy the great southern herd of the American bison. The great buffalo herds that had grazed the prairie for untold thousands of years were soon gone from the earth forever. There was another great beast roaming the Texas prairie during these years. Wild horned cattle descended from the animals brought to the New World by the Spanish. During 300 years in the wilderness, they had evolved into the legendary Texas Longhorn. After the Civil War, millions of these animals roamed the wild lands of Texas. Victorious in the Civil War and economically booming, the northern United States developed a vigorous market for beef. Texas veterans heard of this booming market and began rounding up the Longhorns and driving them north to the railheads in Kansas. The Western Trail to Dodge City came right by Fort Griffin, while the Goodnight Loving Trail to New Mexico and Colorado and the Potter-Bacon Trail to Wyoming and Montana all crisscrossed our area. The Mackenzie Trail started at Fort Griffin and was originally used by the hundreds of wagons that funneled supplies to Colonel Randall Mackenzie and his cavalry troopers during the Indian Wars of 1874 through 1876. This trail, which ended at the Cap Rock near Blanco Canyon, was later the way west for buffalo hunters, ranchers, and settlers of northwest Texas. The saloons, brothels, and gambling halls of Fort Griffin were enlivened by the soldiers, buffalo hunters, and trail drivers who used these trails and roads. While the essential character of the West Texas frontier was wild and lawless, there were nonetheless many strong, God-fearing families who firmly believed in law and order and hungered for a stable future on the land. The focus of life for them was the family, and strong interlocking family units like the Highland clans in Scotland supported each other even to the death. Sally Reynolds Matthews, in her book Interwoven, tells how it was in the heart of her family on a cold winter evening in the confines of the old stone ranch house where a calm air of invincible belief in themselves and their purpose prevailed.
The cooking was done on a wide fireplace. On winter evenings, after the ovens were set aside, the hearth swept, and the table pushed against the wall, the family gathered round the fire. Often the boys would be molding bullets, mother and sisters sewing, knitting, or mending. Many pecans which had been gathered along the banks of the Clear Fork or Walnut Creek a short distance away were cracked and sometimes roasted over the fire.
God-fearing, family-oriented people such as these found the wild, raucous life of Fort Griffin not to their liking, for on the streets of Griffin, lawlessness and violence prevailed. The solid citizens of the area could not depend on the law to protect them, and finally they had had enough. These pioneers had not shrunk from the Comanche menace, nor would they shrink now from the ruffians of the Flat, who thumbed their nose at decency, law, and order. Being determined that right would prevail, the citizens took the law into their own hands. Harsh vigilante justice began. On December 19, 1876, the Fort Worth Daily Democrat reported that Fort Griffin vigilantes had hanged 11 outlaws. That was just the beginning. It was now open warfare between the Vigilance Committee, who wished to establish law and order, and the desperados of Fort Griffin's Flat, who wanted to run wild. Early settler John Chadburn Irving understood the solid citizens' frustrations when he wrote,
"The notorious part of Fort Griffin, known as the Flat, had saloons, gambling, and dance halls, and every form of vice and lawlessness. It looked to me like all the bad characters from everywhere were swarming around there. It got so tough that I was afraid to ride down the streets. During the buffalo and trail herd days, it looked like the civil authorities were either helpless or controlled by the lawless element. Out of this condition sprang the vigilantes."
Finally, the solid citizens of the area decided it would be better to move away from Fort Griffin and start a new town more to their liking. In 1874, they voted to move the county seat of Shackelford some 15 miles south of Fort Griffin and form a new community that Sheriff Bill Kruger named Albany for his old hometown in Georgia. With the establishment of this new town, Fort Griffin soon began to fade. The shadowy characters of the Babylon of the Prairie began drifting away to other, more lively places where there was no threat of vigilantes. They did not dare come to Albany, where one of the first permanent buildings to go up was a very solid two-storied jail, constructed of large stones gathered from the rock ledges of the hills west of town, and is part of the building you are in today. In 1881, two events occurred that really signaled the end of the wild frontier. The tracks of the Texas Central Railroad reached the new town of Albany, and at Old Fort Griffin, taps was played for the last time as the Army left for good, abandoning the post as it was no longer needed. The Comanches and Kiowas were now peacefully established on Oklahoma Reservation. The buffalo had disappeared, as had the trail herds, for the railroads had now come to the cattle range. Towns such as Fort Griffin were no longer needed, for the Wild West was no more. In Albany, a handsome native limestone courthouse was completed in 1883. It was an impressive architectural example that visually conveyed the feeling of stability and law and order that the community desired to present to the world. By 1885, real estate agents in Albany, a new town at the end of the Texas Central Railroad, advertised for new families. As the town grew, the rough edges of the frontier began to soften. Now there was time for such things as croquet and skating in the park. Young men read poetry to girls in white dresses by the creek bank. Couples drifted on the water, shaded by parasols and elm trees. There was a uniform Albany marching band and an orchestra. The sheriff played cello. By 1886, there was even a Shakespeare dramatic club. There were still hard times to come, the terrible droughts, the disappointment of losing to Abilene the transcontinental Texas and Pacific Railroad, but still the pioneers actually began to live a life that mirrored their earlier dreams, their dream of a safe, just, civil, and abundant life with schools and churches in a new land. But it had not been easy. How strong they had to be, these pioneers who brought this about for us. You can see strength in their eyes. Here are people whose story is still being told, and though they are gone, still live in our memory. They are now part of this place just as surely as the river and the hills and the sunrise. They walked this land but a moment ago, and you can still hear their footsteps.